G'day and welcome to another Campfire Project discussion. And today I have with me, first of all, Michael Lauria. How are you, Michael?
I'm awesome, thanks, Alan.
So cold down there in Melbourne?
It's freezing as usual.
Excellent. And then down in Sydney, we've got Peter Balcarek. How are you, Peter?
Very well, thank you. Thank you. Looking forward to this discussion.
We're looking forward to getting you back on here as well. And over there in England, we have Kenny Mammarella-D'Cruz. How are you, Kenny?
Doing good, trying not to be a typical whinging pom because the weather's crap.
It's no use telling us how bad it is over there and that it's freezing over here at the moment, so no sympathy. You should be moving into a warmer period. But,
yeah.
We've been, for our listeners, we've been sitting here talking for some time. You know, we usually come up with a subject that we want to talk about. And we thought, well, we've been talking about a lot of things around masculinity. And we thought, well, let's come up with a title when we finish. So we'll just get the conversation going and see where it goes. And from that, we'll have a topic subject for when we advertise this through the week. So we were talking about masculinity earlier on. So Kenny, would you like to kick us off where we were chatting before?
Yeah, do you know, where we were before, I feel, was dancing around and almost avoiding or denying or not believing in the term toxic masculinity. And for me, the biggest tragedy is the words these days go together. Meanwhile, in my world, they've got nothing to do with each other. Toxic is one thing and masculinity is another thing. And non-toxic and femininity and toxic and femininity, you know, it's just, they're words that are separate. And I know that I have masculinity and I have femininity. And sometimes my behavior is toxic and sometimes it's not toxic. Maybe it's where I come from or my mood or the way I'm expressing myself. But the tragedy of putting toxic masculinity together and pushing it on men, and so many younger men, especially these days, are scared to go out dating because they're scared of being labeled something, the toxic masculine or me too or whatever, and they just don't know what to say and where to go. And then the older men are scared to take part for similar reasons, and also scared to be with younger people in case someone puts another label on them. It's like, where do we put ourselves and how can we be more authentic, true men taking part in life without fear of these nasty labels that I kind of feel like aren't fair, aren't true, and can limit our presence, our passion.
Yeah, it's like Peter was saying earlier on about the being men, and when are we going to be proud about being men again? We've got that fear all the time. It's like the political correctness. You're very careful about what you say all the time, to the point that you're not talking to anybody. You're always in that fear that you're going to upset somebody and that's going to come back on you. And for men who are trying to be the right sort of men, to fit in society, do the right thing, it's pretty difficult. So Peter, when you were talking about that before yourself, what sort of experience have you had in that particular area?
Do you know what I was going to do? Oh, sorry, that was Peter. Go on.
Yeah, you go. It looks like you have
I was going to take a huge risk and say one thing that I believe. This is like, so I've poo-pooed toxic masculinity, but I wonder whether I work with the toxic femininity in the minds of men, because the most powerful together men who I work with, who might be narcissists, they might be bullies, whatever it is, what they fear is so-called toxic femininity, their projection that they might be withdrawn from, which is a feminine trait, not necessarily female, or criticized, or abandoned, or humiliated, or ridiculed. So if masculinity is yang and it's out and it's loud, then this is yin and it's in and it's quiet. But I have seen the most powerful men crumble with their little boy inside being abandoned, so to speak. So yeah, that's the other side of things. And I guess I jumped in and took over there. And you could say that that's me being a toxic male. I don't know.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Just having so much to say there. So, so back to Peter.
Yeah, I don't find it toxic at all, Kenny. Feel free to do it again. For me, I don't really have direct experience with it, but it's just because I'm passionate about men's health and men's well-being as such. And I do a lot of reading, and I watch the media, and especially how the media portrays this topic. You know, it's not only terms like toxic masculinity, but we have other terms like mansplaining, manspreading. You know, and these are all terms that have popped up just recently, and all of them describe negative behavior that men do, right? And what I feel is like the fact that we already have specific term for it, and many times these terms are being overused. You know, it's like putting a light on the negative behavior of men and labeling it something that is very negative again, as opposed to just saying, hey, that's just a person that behaves like a dick, you know, like a dickhead, you know. But we don't do that when it comes to negative behavior of women. So I guess my position on it is, number one, these terms are fabricated. They are not real. They are creating, again, negativity around men and about men's behavior. And not all men behave in a negative way, but we do, but it's just negative behavior. It doesn't have to have specific negative term attached to it. And then if the other extreme, if I take it, which I don't think is the right way to go either, but in the name of equality, we should have those similar negative terms for negative female behavior. I don't think it's the right way to go, but hey, we are up for equality. We should kind of shed light on negative female behavior as well, because there are a lot of women that do exhibit negative behavior, right? So, and the impact of that is that if a man does something that is not considered right under the society standards, there's straight away term for it. And it's like men are reprimanded for toxic masculinity, for mansplaining, and also like every time a man explains something to someone, and especially when it's a woman, so they would be already considered to be a mansplaining, right? So I don't think it helps. I don't think it, even in any slightest form, it doesn't address the issue of rectifying the negative behavior. It just actually makes it worse, you know. And as you have the Campfire Project, you know, we are all in this together. So let's address the negative behavior on a whole, as men and women, and not as only against men, and reprimand men for everything bad that they do. I don't know. Does that make sense, or does it?
Well, I think the comment you said, where if we had the same for women, then we look at that before we went there and we went, well, that wouldn't be right either. That then gets us a chance to do a U-turn and come back and go, hey, we shouldn't be doing this with men either.
Yeah.
We don't want to introduce it. It's wrong. We shouldn't introduce it to women. Therefore, we should be looking at removing it from men, getting it out altogether.
Yeah, I would love for that to happen. I don't think it's going to happen that soon, but I would love for that to happen. Yeah.
Because the only way you have equality is when we're all on the same page doing the same thing. So you can't have one rule for one and one rule for the other. But it's a case of not going, well, okay, well, that's a rule over here. We better put it over there as well. We go, no, if that would be wrong to put it over there, then, well, you should come back and go, how do we remove it from over here as well?
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Work together
yeah, and I think that Michael is, I guess, super passionate about this from us, you know, like what does it actually mean, the toxic masculinity, and why the negative traits or the violent traits or the not so popular traits of masculinity that are very required in our lives in certain situations, why they're labeled toxic as opposed to just part of masculinity that many times we just have to integrate, you know, and he writes about it in his book. So maybe time for you to step in, Michael, on this.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Peter. One of the things I've noticed in society over the last few years especially is this real intense indoctrination of toxic masculinity in our society. And it's quite damaging because not only are men not feeling comfortable in just embodying all of the really awesome aspects of being a man as a result of all of this, plus a very, plus a Me Too movement, which has strayed so far away from its original concept, and, fourth and fifth wave feminism, which has now gone so far to the left that it's also strayed from the original intention of what it first started out to do, which was to really bring women into the same league, I guess, as men. And so when we start to look at all of these facets of our society and how things have evolved over the last decade or so especially, we start to see a society, or start to recognise a society that appears to be almost trying to suppress the masculine in men in such a way that anytime a man steps into anything that is embodying anything that looks like masculinity within a man, it's repressed. And this also sends a very damaging message to boys, because boys in school now and boys growing up into teenage years are very confused about what behaviour is appropriate and what isn't, what is it okay for me to say and what isn't, and what does being a man actually even mean. And then when they're then guided by fathers who are just as confused or even more confused, that's going to create the next generation of men who have no purpose, no direction, they have no idea how to actually embody or integrate any aspects of the masculine within themselves at all. So I wonder what sort of men we're going to end up with in 20 years' time who are running society. And I think part of this as well has got to do with this false assumption that we've lived in a very strong, powerful, patriarchal society for many years.
Tyrannical patriarchy.
Pardon?
Tyrannical patriarchy. That's right.
Yep. So that's the agenda that's being pushed. And what we don't actually realise is that if we're being honest and if we're being real about this and very transparent, if men are being honest about this, we know that women actually have all the power, really. And we look at relationships, and I'm also a relationship coach, as all of you know. So we look at relationships, and men behave, usually they will behave based on what they believe the woman in their life wants from them. And they will provide exactly what that is as well. And I always go back to the medieval days of the king and the queen. So and I think we've spoken about this, Alan, when all of the villagers will come up, during the day and ask the king for advice, and the king will pass judgment and make laws and all this sort of stuff. And then the king's sitting on the throne and the queen's right next to him, behind a little bit, to the side, but back a little bit. And this is what you see in all of the artwork and even in movies. But then after all the villagers have gone home and the king and the queen go back into their chambers, the queen is very, very comfortable in telling the king exactly where he did wrong, exactly the wrong decisions that he made and where he should do better next time. And the king will always, almost, what's the word? He will always bow to the queen in the privacy of their own privacy. And so what people don't understand and what society doesn't understand is that there's such strength in the feminine in women, and there's that can even guide the masculine in a man to some point. And so when we start to understand that men and women are just as powerful as each other in their own way, I think then we'll start to dismiss some of these things that we see in society now, which are toxic masculinity and this toxic feminist movement that we see as well, and all of this stuff. So that's my perspective. But at the very core of it, if men can start to really embody what it means to have a sense of purpose and contribution and to live a fulfilled and meaningful life, I think we will see a lot of these disembodied masculine attributes that we find very difficult to bring forward, or most men do. I think we'll find them embodied in a much more healthy way, in a much more well-balanced and integrated way. And then terminology like toxic masculinity won't have a place in society.
I agree with all that. I agree with what Kenny was saying about having the masculinity and the word toxic completely separate from each other, that they shouldn't be together, and that's where it's coming in. You mentioned, we were talking earlier on about confidence, and men who don't feel confident, boys who don't feel confident, anyone who doesn't feel confident is going to react in a way that's going to be aggressive, or they're going to be fighting. So it's when someone, like a bully, for instance, they've usually been bullied, that's why they become bullies. They're wanting to raise their self-esteem. And while men feeling that there's no pride in being a man, there's a fear of what we say and everything else, that's got a latent level of hostility. They're just waiting for that moment to come out, and that's when we're starting to see what we refer to as a toxic masculinity. So it's helping those men to become more confident in their own right, to be able to clear that away. It's not so much fixing the toxic masculinity, it's working with the men and the confidence levels, so the toxic side of it just will disappear. What are your thoughts on that, Kenny?
To pick up with what Michael said about in 20 years' time, I wonder whether in 20 years' time, or even for me right here and now, whether it is about male and female, even masculine and feminine, even man and boy. I wonder if it's more about just being authentic in the moment. And sometimes when I'm authentic in the moment, I'm more feminine than I am masculine, because I might be listening and responding rather than maybe doing and reacting. And there's neither right or wrong. There's a time and a place. And last week, when I was in the forest with my best friend, we were little boys, and that was appropriate and it was blissful. So that was us, from the men that we are, extending to the little boys, or allowing the little boy out, or me, maybe in the workplace, extending and allowing the female or the feminine part of me out. So I'm not sure that it's like what's going to happen to men or what's going to happen to women. I feel like we are surely growing into our love and embracing, including our fear, and growing into here and now, rather than the shoulds and the history and, you know, the head stuff. And for me, it's a lot more, and this has been probably the most courageous thing I've done in my life, is get here and now, because here and now is incredibly intimate and vulnerable. And it's here and now in this vulnerable moment that I feel more powerful. And it's not power over, it's the power to be here and to tell the truth, whether it's right or wrong, but to contribute something and then learn from there. So yeah, it's like, thank God it's all splitting and falling apart with masculine, feminine, and toxic and non-toxic and aggressive and passive-aggressive, because everything's up. And it's like, here's the mess. Now, how are we going to emerge as self-respecting, self-aware individuals?
Because if we're going to write here and now, it's all on us as individuals. Whereas if we look at, well, what's the future going to be, that's putting it out there and putting it away from us. And so gives us a reason, you know, an excuse to just sit back and watch what's going on, and go later on, go, oh, we told you so, or whatever. It always comes back to what are each and all of us doing right now in this present moment.
And this is where education comes in as well. Teaching boys as well as men what it actually means to be a good quality human being. What it actually means to be a good quality human being. And I agree with a lot of what Kenny said. I will highlight something in my experience, professionally and personally, mostly professionally, that I observe in relationships with clients. And that is that there's always a disconnect that happens within couples, and that always happens because we see what happens is that whilst there's masculine and feminine attributes in both men and women, definitely, and it's important to fully integrate and embody both of those parts of us into a well-balanced individual, the predominant energy in a man is the masculine and the predominant energy in a woman is the feminine. And when we see a man and a woman in a heterosexual relationship, when they start to form an attraction, the attraction is there because of the polarity between the two of them, the predominant masculine in the man, the predominant feminine in the woman. And then it's only over time when we start to see these blend and merge and fuse in some way and they become unbalanced, is when relationships start to really break apart. And this is because people have gotten into relationships unconsciously, they stay in them unconsciously, and then they cause issues unconsciously within relationships. And in my coaching with people, when I start to bring that polarity back into balance again, and we start to find that the man embodies the masculine traits at a higher level while still be connected with his feminine, and the woman or the female embodies her feminine aspects at a higher level, but still is in touch with her masculine traits, you find that the polarity starts to readjust, and they start to get along, and they start to connect, and they start to form more connected relationship with each other. And so I agree with everything Kenny said. I can't move away, though, from the fact that the predominant energy in a man is masculine, the predominant energy in a woman is feminine. And when we start to mess with that too much, we start to see or observe disconnect between men and women. And I'm seeing that this is what is happening over the last 20 to 30 years, maybe even 40 years, gradually. That's what I've noticed.
You know, what this reminds me of so much is that what I believe to be the world is actually my world and not the world. It's my experience of the world and what I attract and who I attract to prove me right and wrong. Even Facebook does this for me. It doesn't show me a cross-section of society. It reflects back my bubble because it knows who I am and what I like, so it'll give me more of that. And the reason I say that is because in my experience, some of the men that I work with are predominantly feminine, or they don't know they're masculine. And especially a trans client I have has been actually in pain with his masculine, that in order to ease the pain and start from zero, he is going through whatever he is going through to be a she, to relieve that pain. So I totally agree there's masculine and feminine in all of us, but maybe not so much now, but I would say maybe 3 years ago, the couples that I attracted, and for me, couples always come in, clients always come in batches with issues. I had a batch of clients where the couple worked when the male was allowed permission to take a more feminine role, and the female was allowed permission to take a more masculine role, because then they could both be more authentic, and it actually worked. So rather than this is what you have and what you should do and this is yours, it's like, who are you and what might you experiment with to make this work? So that's not to say that I also believe that a lot of males can be more masculine, and maybe it's the people that I work with in London, or maybe it's that I attract a lot of men who haven't been around men, who have been responsible for the emotions of women, so they're extending themselves to find their masculine part. But in my experience in, I guess, central London and the people who I attract, I do attract a lot of very male, masculine men. I attract a lot of privately educated men, and I attract a reasonable amount of female men, and they all want to know how to be them better so they can contribute to their own lives and society in truth. So I can't disagree, and it seems that maybe we have slightly different client base where yours are a lot more male masculine, where mine can be a lot more female boy all over the place, exploring, etc. And it's like, what is true? And it's also what's true for me right now, because I know that as I went more into my feminine in my early 30s, it's only going into my feminine that I could really allow space for my true masculine. I needed both extremes to find what was really true for me.
Is it that, with you're saying, Michael, is that the man being the more masculine, the woman being feminine, that actually is the cause of the attraction that brings them together? But from what I'm getting from you, Kenny, is that the ability to understand the other and also then show that side is what makes that relationship even stronger again. So where the men in the first instance have lost their masculinity or feel that it's been taken away from it in a partnership, they're going to fall apart. They're going to pull apart. but to have that true essence of getting back to being what they believe to be masculine, and at the same time having that empathy and understanding for the feminine side, and therefore being able to express that, because they're not really taken away from masculine when they're expressing that other side. It's bringing another understanding in.
Maybe I can clarify a little bit. So where I'm going with this is, yes, everything that I just said, I truly believe, and in my experience, that's what works in relationships. Having said that, it only works when, as Kenny was saying, people are allowed to be and are permitted to be and have permission to be their true and authentic selves. That doesn't negate the predominant energy within a man or a woman. What that means is that we are starting to create higher quality, better quality, more embodied people who have fully integrated their shadow as well. And when you fully integrate the shadow, which is what Carl Jung talks about, which is our unconscious mind, when we fully integrate the shadow, then we are very much in touch with both our masculine and our feminine. And so whilst in a man, the predominant energy is masculine, there are appropriate times, as often as they need to be, where the feminine can be expressed as well. And that's about where he can be his true authentic self as a man, expressing whatever he needs to express, and being compassionate and being nurturing and doing all these sorts of things that are attributes of the feminine, whilst still embodying what it means to be a man, because he's integrated all of these aspects of himself within himself to then be able to express outwardly from a totally embodied and integrated state. And that's where I'm going with this. So that's what I want my clients to create within themselves. Yeah.
Excellent. So, Peter, have you got any comments on that? I can see you thinking there.
Yeah. One of the things why maybe we struggle with the expression of masculinity and what masculinity is and why masculinity is so scrutinized is, could be, I don't have any scientific data to support it, but could be the fact that, in last few decades, men are really brought up mainly by women. Right? It's not how it used to be, that you would have a tribe of men where you would have your rites of passage or anything like that. So we grow up, a lot of, 80% of the custodies are given to women. So predominantly women are bringing up young boys. And then when you go to school, most of teachers are, again, females. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I'm just saying that if you're going to be brought up by women who, let's assume, have predominantly feminine attributes or feminine behavior, then you will be confused about how you should behave as a man. And especially if you don't have any positive masculine male role models, you will be confused. So maybe that is one of the reasons why masculinity is so under the radar, not under the radar, but under microscope these days, because we don't really know, there's not few generations of men who haven't been brought up by other men. It's not necessarily brought up by a father, but by a group of men, right? So even in the past, you would go hunting. So if your father wasn't there, somebody else, an elder from the tribe, would look after you.
I'm so pleased you brought this up. And even when you look at, it is a fact that most of the shootings in America was committed by men. I don't even know about any that was committed by women. Maybe there was one or two, but most of them were committed by men. And most of those men come from broken families without any positive role models. So brought up by women, right? So I don't know, logically, that would not be toxic masculinity. Go on.
I think when we're talking about masculinity in that role, we're not really talking about it's a distorted view of it. The way I always understood, first of all, it takes a village to raise a family, to raise children. So it is the other men, the other people around, so the children get...
Just one moment.
What's that, sorry? Okay.
It just needs to go somewhere for a moment.
Yep. Okay, so with the... it was a village that raised the children. If we think about mum's role was to set up the domestic boundaries for the child, the safety and everything else. But as the children grew up, Dad's job was then to start to introduce the world boundaries, to give the boys in particular direction when they go out in the right way, how to go out into the world the right way. But if there's no men around, they're only getting the protection, the safety boundaries, the domestic ones, but they're not getting the world boundaries. This is why I've got so many boys out there of all ages who are doing the wrong things. Yeah. Whereas, and when we talk about domestic violence, for instance, the men, yes, it is mostly men, and that's maybe because there's more heterosexual relationships, but we also know in lesbian relationships, the incidence of domestic violence is just as high. So it's not so much a gender thing, but more a self-esteem and other issues around it. And it affects
it's alcohol, it's environment, it's drug abuse, it's financial problems. It's not really a gender issue. Yeah,
that's it. So it's when we get away from looking at the genders being the problem and realise that it's the behaviours behind that, the circumstance, the way we're growing up, and the demands that we're putting on everybody, and they're unrealistic. We're telling a boy, don't act like a boy, but become a man. Yeah, but who's setting the parameters up for being a man? There's so much confusion out there. So we've got, as I said, there are very few males in primary school teaching, because if a man's doing that, then people look at him and go, well, there's something wrong with him. So we had a lot of men who weren't in those roles.
Yeah.
So if we're going to raise boys the right way, yes, we need the rites of passage. We need men around them. It's not just dad. Because if you're the only one raising your son, then your son's going to be a clone of you. They don't have their own real true personality. It's what they get from all the other men, and they create their own personality, which is unique to everybody else. And at that moment, they've got a true value to the tribe.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing as well, today, I think that in Australia and Western world, we as men are starting to be very good at actually being aware that the masculinity, or what definition of masculinity is in transition. And the suicide rates, society encourages men to speak up and share their feelings and be open, but for that you need to be able to share your shadow. You need to be able to talk about your darkness. You need to be able to talk about the bad stuff. And as soon as you talk about your bad stuff, it's labeled toxic masculinity. So once you, and it takes a lot of courage for a man to share the shadow. And then as soon as they share the shadow, maybe in counseling sessions, or maybe even like with friends and stuff, they get shut down because that shadow is toxic. So it's more like okay, well, I shared something that's considered to be bad, and now I'm a bad person. I'm now a bad man, so I'm not going to share again.
These are the fundamentally important things that I feel, or the place that a man needs to enter into to actually exist. Because I wonder how many men even know their feelings, or have the words to articulate their feelings, or even have a community or one person where these thoughts and feelings can be met and explored without being fixed, ridiculed, upstaged, abandoned, etc., etc. And this is exactly why, there are the men's groups, but now I'm launching a charity this year to train people to listen and hold a space for men to find out. Because if it's not safe to say anything because there might be a label, then it's all obviously going to be suppressed, and then either depressed or expressed through anger, or maybe drunk or drugged or whatever it is, because there is no space for the man or the individual to even exist. I would say, to go back to earlier on when we were talking about boys being brought up by women, I would say that is so important, because with most of my clients, irrespective of their means, it's now there's a baby, the woman obviously takes care of the baby, especially in the beginning, and then it's not just the mother's rules beyond her role, then it's the mother's family way, and the father is used to being out of it, and the boy is brought up in the mother's and the mother's family way, and believes that this is right, and then begins to understand how female emotions work, and how to stay out of trouble and not cause trouble. And it's all very much an extension into the female head before it's right. Now now the man is supposed to somehow take the child and show it a male perspective. Is there space for that? Does there need to be some sort of a passing, even at the age of 6 or 7? Or does it stay with my client yesterday, for example, who said that the only time he feels he actually existed in his life was when he was a child setting fire to things, because everything else was taking care of the needs of women and being what he thought women wanted. And it was all about, am I safe? Am I acceptable? Am I good enough? Am I going to be rejected or ridiculed or whatever? And it was all handing power over to be accepted by the women without knowing who he is as a man. And this is where he is now, not only finding out and exploring it, but as he becomes his own man, life can meet him, because there is a person to meet, and the dance of life can actually begin. So I agree, it starts with, where is the space for the child? And then the child going from the feminine and responsibility for the feminine and fear of abandonment from the feminine into I am.
Yeah, because as a boy grows up, that first 7 years as the full-on nurtured from mum, he's being protected and everything else. From the age of 7 to 14, in tribal times, he would then be more around his grandfather and father, more so his grandfather, because his grandfather wasn't out hunting, but the father was out, but he was also spending time with the son, and that was getting the child ready, the boy ready to go through his rite of passage at the age of 14, where he would then be around the other men. Now, at the age of 21, when his wife is carrying the baby, and therefore the next 7 years, in that next 7 years up to 28 years old, that's when he was learning the role of how to take that job on himself for his own children that his father took on for him. We haven't got that today. So we've got these boys growing up in the feminine environment, then having nowhere to go and being told they can't be like some guy who's already failed out there. And so we're being held back from getting into our true masculinity. We need to get in and around. This is why the Campfire, this is why the men's groups that you run, all the gatherings where men get together. We're actually going back into that childhood, into that area of understanding the rite of passage and hopefully learning it well enough to be able to work with our children who are at that age right now.
And the beauty of what you've just said includes community, where the tragedy of where I feel a lot of people are now is it's not about community. It's about competition. It's about separation. It's about having more, caring less, and not going into the places that need to be discussed, which could be around death, sex and sexuality, fear, not having enough, having too much and being embarrassed about having to. That's all separation. What you're talking about is a healthy community.
It's all inclusion.
Yeah, exactly. Which, by the way, could be seen as feminine. Or for me, it's like the mature masculine includes the feminine, because it's not all competition, it's collaboration, and it's listening, and it's responding. And you could call them feminine traits. I would say it takes these feminine traits to be an adult masculine or an adult male.
I loved it when you mentioned that, because it really brings it together. That's masculine, as we understand it, is being out there, trailblazing, going out into the world, but the inclusion is something that we don't really do when we're out there on our own. So that sort of relates back to the feminine, but it's not it's not female, but it's a completely healthy energy where the child has the people around the inclusion. So in my own situation, I was 50 before I started my journey into manhood. Now, most people would say, oh, you're a man at the age of 16, 17, 18 years old. No, not by my interpretation of it and as I understand it. I was just an old boy. So still on the journey. When I get there, I'll let you know when I get there, but somebody will probably be putting the nails in the coffin by that stage.
So let's take my arm.
No, it's going to be a long time, so it's going to be a long journey for me. But the way I look at it is that we need that inclusion. We need the men around. And when you've got a community working together, you've got both masculine and feminine within the community. So there's no separation. And this is why all these groups of Me Too, Men Too and everything else, yes, they had a purpose. They were needed at that time, but then they become tribes. And those tribes always fight. because when one's pulling one way, the other one's got to compensate for it to try and equal it out, which means you don't have inclusion. You always have separation.
And the most dangerous thing with all of these groups and these exactly what you were just talking about is the conflicting agendas that are indoctrinating our society into certain ways of thinking, certain ways of believing. And when that starts to bleed into schools as well, because we're even starting to teach kids in Australia here about toxic masculinity, right? It's even coming into schools, and you've got to wonder what's the agenda. What's the agenda here? And it can't be good. It actually can't be good. What for me, when I see kids being taught about toxic masculinity in schools, and boys being told that it is inappropriate for them to express themselves as a boy, just as a boy normally does, I wonder what emotional damage that is going to cause these children as they're growing up, not just the boys, but the girls as well, because they're getting a very warped view of what it means to be a well-balanced human being. Because there's been certain attributes in girls that are being heightened to meet this imagined threat of toxic masculinity. And then there are attributes in boys that are being suppressed because they're being told that they're toxic. And so this is going to create, and already is creating, an imbalance in society, and will create an imbalance in people as we have children working their way up and growing into teenagehood. And then when they start to hit puberty, God knows what's going to happen then, with these children who are being indoctrinated into these really unhealthy values and beliefs around what it means to be a well-balanced and good quality human being.
And I love the word human being. You've gone to that quite a few times. You've gone away from boys and men and women and girls and gone to the human, which brings it in inclusion again.
Yeah.
That's where I love that, going with that. But I had a few people when I first started the Campfire Project who said to me, "Oh, is this secret men's business?" And I said, "No, it's just men's business." But the whole thing is, for the men that are in here, for them to find their way to become more powerful in themselves, the greatest recipients are their partners and their children. We are all connected in the environment. So while somebody is working on this, so it's like you're working with somebody and they're depressed, they've got their family and everything else, they're upset and everything else. You get them away from that, you get them back to their full strength, and then you bring them back again. While they're in that environment, they're no good to anybody. So you tell people, get selfish so you can be selfless and come back again. So it's always the bigger picture. It's not just the individual. It's a connection within the environment, within everybody else. So the men in here who are doing things and changing their lives and moving forward, their partners are recipients, the ones who get out of this. Their children are the ones who get most of it out of it. We're all connected.
And when you create better quality people, you create better quality families. And when you create better quality families, you create better quality communities. And then we create better quality society and a better quality of humanity.
That's it.
Yeah.
And I wonder how much of this, my fear is how much people, including me, can get so sucked into the debate in my head and thinking about it and navigating it, rather than following how I feel and what feels right and what doesn't feel right. And as soon as I go into my head to think, is this toxic? Am I being good? Am I going to be found out for something that's not true or whatever? I'm coming from fear and I'm navigating something. I'm almost projecting fear out that I then need to survive and prove something. Meanwhile, I'm disconnected from the present. There's no love there. And I feel that my personal mission is to be present and connected in love. And if something comes up, then to get to know myself there, rather than to disconnect, fear, come up with some good lines, and then sell that. That's just too cheap. And I so fear how much the kids are being put into their heads by adults and by all of this, rather than who are you, how are you, how do you feel? And it's basically like find out in the playground as you interact with other human beings who might be similar and different to you. But yeah, it's like it's taking part with love rather than working it out in their head with fear.
Yeah. So when you go into the thinking, well, I look at my second marriage and realise that, well, you know, I pretty much destroyed that by the thinking and the fear that went with it. Yes, there were a lot of emotions, but they were fear-based emotions. They weren't that feeling that would have been more positive.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you're absolutely right on that.
Yeah, but I think that what's happening these days, you know, with the kids as well, is that they live like in a bit of a bubble wrap, right? And what we tend to do with kids is under the veil of, you know, safety and creating of the safety environment, we're actually doing them disservice, because what you mentioned before, Kenny, is like, okay, well, express what you feel. But it doesn't mean that I'm going to be only expressing something that is labeled as positive. You know, expressing what you feel means that you need to express something that is negative, many times negative towards other people, right? And if other people are going to get offended, and that's going to be labeled as offensive behavior, when these days everything is being offensive. Like I've read that one campus in America has introduced new offensive terms, and on the list of offensive terms were terms like husband and wife, right? So like how much further is this going to go? And then that means that you cannot actually express yourself. So everything that you are expressing has the potential to offend someone. Therefore, authentic expression is going to be non-existent. And
it's going to be wild, isn't it? It's going to be wild.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
Some aspects it really has, because all it takes is for one person, for a person to say, or to say, I'm offended, and then the other person must have done something offensive.
Yeah. So, and exactly, like, we are absolutely not looking at the intention behind expression of feeling or behavior. We are looking at how somebody is taking it, right? And I think it's our responsibility to realize that, okay, I'm offended. Well, there is a part of me that is offended, and that part of me needs to be healed. It doesn't mean that that person actually intended to offend us.
Doesn't need to be pushed onto someone else.
Great example of this is latest scandal with Liam Neeson, where he shared this experience where, you know, when he was young, one of his friends was raped by a African Englishman, and then he felt this rage, and he felt like he wants to kill a black man, and this is what he said publicly on TV. And this was his shadow. It was 20 years ago. He integrated it. He admitted that it was the wrong thing to say. He said, I was ashamed for 2 weeks for thinking this. And his career was almost done, just because he admitted the fact that this is how he felt at that time.
That's right. The focus wasn't on what he had realised out of it and everything else. The focus was on his first comment, which was totally wrong. I keep thinking about all these terms that are being created today. Who's actually bringing these terms up and putting them into, these are the ones we should be staying away from? It's not the healthy people, it's the damaged people who are coming up with it. So we're letting the damaged community control where the community's going.
Absolutely.
And the only way that can go is further damage. It's like helicopter parenting. That's trying to protect the child for the parent's sake, not for the child. I keep using the term, every time I'm talking to couples and families, I'm talking about, we are not carpenters and we are not sculptors. Our job is not to mould our kids into something. Our job is, as a gardener, our job is to nurture the child so they can grow into the best version of themselves. And that's what mum does, sets up that domestic boundary for them and guides them through those early stages and keeps them safe and everything else. And their dad opens their world up for them, but guides them through that so that they can find the best journey for themselves, but a guided one, not just left to their own devices doing the wrong thing. So we need to get back to not being sculptors or carpenters, but being those gardeners and raising our kids the right way.
I feel that especially for us who do this kind of work, it's very important to get the language right of when it is people or the mainstream and when it is we. Because very often when people say we, I'm not one of those we. And sometimes when people say always, well, that always is so distant in my past that I forgot it existed. And I feel it's creating these spaces for change and for a new normality is surely part of us living our purpose rather than having these ideas and wanting this. It's not about wanting it, surely it's about being it into reality here and now. And it's not just the language I find I use out into the world, but more important than that, it's reprogramming and updating the language in my mind. Because I believe from that, especially my shadow, that's what I create. I create what I need to see and what needs to be released to set me free. That wasn't supposed to rhyme, but it sounded quite good.
Very poetic.
Yeah, we've got it on the recording, so I'll be able to write it out properly later on, so I remember it all. and I like it, so I'll steal it.
Maybe that should be the title of the talk. That rhyme.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I reckon we could probably talk on this for quite a long time, but we probably have to bring things to an end shortly. So I'd just like to thank all three of you for being here again, and to everybody who's been here today. Listen into what they've said, get in touch with these men as well and have a chat with them, because they've all got so much to offer. And again, thanks. Well, you've changed positions on the screen when you dropped out there before, so it's like, oh, Peter, you're up the top now. So thanks very much, Peter, for being here, for Kenny as well, and also for Michael. Thanks, mate.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Catch you next time.
Catch you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.